In the blistering heat of the Persian Gulf, on a mud flat in the Shatt al-Arab waterway, stood the most valuable piece of real estate in the British Empire. Not a gold mine in South Africa or a tea plantation in India, but a sprawling tangle of steel pipes, cooling towers, and smokestacks, the Abadan refinery. In 1951, this facility was the world's largest oil refinery, covering a square mile of desert and processing 25 million tons of crude annually. Every drop of that oil, every penny of profit from the black blood pumping through those pipes, belonged to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To the British government, 4,000 miles away in London's grey drizzle, Abadan was more than an industrial asset. It was life support. The British Empire had emerged from the Second World War victorious but destitute. The treasury was empty, drained by the fight against Hitler. The country drowned in debt to the United States, while its people lived on rations, eating powdered eggs, and wearing utility clothing. Only hard currency from overseas assets prevented total economic collapse, and Iranian oil was by far the biggest earner. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, known today as BP, was essentially a state within a state. It generated millions of pounds flowing directly into the British exchequer, fueled the Royal Navy, powered the factories of the Midlands, the financial lung allowing a shrinking empire to keep breathing. But this massive engine of wealth sat in a country that was waking up. Iran was an ancient civilization with proud history, yet for half the 20th century had been treated as little more than a colonial resource extraction zone. The British ran the oil industry with breathtaking arrogance. In Abadan, British administrators lived in segregated enclaves resembling English suburbs, cricket pitches, manicured lawns, swimming pools, air-conditioned bungalows. They imported food from London and drank gin and tonics on verandas, while Iranian workers lived in shanty towns made of flattened oil drums just outside the fence, with no running water or electricity, suffering unbearable heat, often reaching 120 degrees. Workers were paid pennies, had no rights, and were treated as coolies in their own country. The injustice was mathematical. In 1950 alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company made a profit of £170 million, but paid the Iranian government less than $16 million in royalties. The British government collected more in taxes from the company than Iran received for its own natural resource. For decades, Iranians simmered with resentment. In 1951, that resentment exploded into revolution, and its face was Mohammad Mossadegh, an aristocrat, lawyer, and passionate nationalist. Elderly and frail, prone to fainting spells and public weeping, he wore pajamas to diplomatic meetings. British diplomats dismissed him as a hysteric, a clown, but they underestimated him completely. Mossadegh was a brilliant politician who understood what the British had forgotten: the power of dignity. Mossadegh argued a simple point. The oil beneath Iranian soil belonged to the Iranian people, a gift from God to the nation, not a dividend for London shareholders. He demanded the books be opened and a 50-50 profit split, similar to American oil companies' recent deal with Saudi Arabia. The British refused. Sir William Fraser, chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and a man of the old imperial school, believed Iranians incapable of running the industry. He treated the Iranian government like a rebellious employee, refusing to negotiate or open the books, believing the Iranians would back down because they needed British technicians. Fraser's arrogance lit The fuse. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. Weeks later, they elected Mossadegh prime minister. The news hit London like a seismic shock. A third world nation had seized the greatest British asset. It was theft, humiliation, and a signal that the British lion was toothless. In the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, Clement Attlee's Labour government was paralyzed with terror. Losing oil revenue would collapse the pound, crash living standards to third world levels, and prevent food imports. British military chiefs drew up Operation Buccaneer, plans to seize Abadan by force using paratroopers and Marines. But Treasury officials delivered brutal truth. They couldn't afford a war. An invasion would cost millions, require occupying a country the size of Western Europe, and turn the Muslim world against Britain. President Harry Truman, bogged down in Korea, warned he wouldn't support an invasion. Without American money, Britain couldn't fight. The gunboats stayed in harbor. Instead, Britain launched economic war. They organized a total blockade of Iranian oil. The Royal Navy patrolled the Persian Gulf, announcing any tanker buying Iranian oil would be treated as handling stolen property. They threatened legal action worldwide, froze Iranian assets in British banks, and stopped exporting steel and sugar to Iran. British engineers were ordered to leave. In a scene of national drama, the British staff boarded HMS Mauritius and sailed away. The refinery fell silent, pipes dried up, storage tanks sat full, but the tap was closed. Britain tried strangling Iran into submission, believing that without oil revenue, the economy would collapse, the people would starve, and they would overthrow Mossadegh and beg the British to return. But Mossadegh refused to break. He told his people they would rather be poor and free than rich and enslaved, calling it an economy without oil. He issued bonds and asked people to endure hardship for sovereignty. The Iranian people responded, rallying around him. He became a hero not just in Iran, but across the developing world. The man who stood up to the British Empire. In October 1951, Winston Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister at 77 years old. A man of the 19th century, living in the nuclear age. He had personally converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil in 1913 and viewed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company as his child. He saw Abadan's loss as personal insult, hated being bullied by a man in pajamas, and ranted about showing strength. But economic reality hadn't changed. The British economy remained on life support, gold reserves dwindled, and Americans still said no to war. Churchill, the great warrior, realized bitterly he led a second-rate power unable to order the fleet because he couldn't pay for fuel. He needed a different weapon: shadows, spies. MI6 began plotting a coup called Operation Boot, using bribery and propaganda to create chaos in Tehran, turn people against Mossadegh, and install a pro-British general. But in 1952, Mossadegh discovered the plot. He expelled all British diplomats, kicking them out. MI6 lost its network and couldn't run a coup from London. They needed Americans inside Tehran to distribute cash and give orders. Churchill needed the CIA. President Truman had no interest overthrowing a democratically elected leader to save a British oil monopoly. He saw Mossadegh as a nationalist, not a communist, and sympathized with Iranian resource control. But time favored Churchill. In November 1952, America elected Dwight Eisenhower, who appointed the Dulles brothers, John Foster as Secretary of State, Allen as CIA director. These Cold Warriors saw the world in black and white, a global chessboard where every move was US versus Soviet Union. Churchill saw his opening. He couldn't sell a coup based on saving British oil profits. Americans didn't care, and American oil companies welcomed the British monopoly's collapse. So Churchill changed the narrative, stopped talking about oil, and started talking about communism. He sent diplomats and spies to Washington, spinning a terrifying story. Mossadegh was weak, the British blockade was destroying Iran's economy, and in the chaos, the Tudeh party, Iranian communists, would seize power. Iran would fall behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union would control the Persian Gulf and warm water ports they'd sought for centuries, controlling Western oil supply. "It's not about our money," the British lied. "It's about your security. If you don't act now, Tehran will be Moscow by Christmas." Masterful manipulation. Churchill exploited American paranoia, using fear of the Red Menace to make Americans do the British Empire's dirty work. Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers bought it, terrified of Soviet Iran. They agreed to a joint operation, CIA leading with MI6, providing intelligence. They renamed it Operation Ajax with a budget of $1 million, arguably the highest return on investment in espionage history. The man chosen was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, a romantic figure, the quintessential American spy. In summer 1953, he slipped into Iran from Iraq carrying a fake passport and a suitcase. Inside wasn't a bomb or radio, but cash, stacks of Iranian rials and US dollars. Having failed to invade with soldiers or starve the country with sanctions, they would try the oldest trick, buying a revolution. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran, a powder keg, where the British blockade had done its work. The economy was collapsing, inflation rampant, the middle class wiped out. People who'd cheered Mossadegh 2 years ago were now hungry and anxious. The nationalist movement's unity was fraying. The stage was set, the script written, the actors, generals, gangsters, journalists, clerics, waiting for payment. Churchill sat in London, smoking cigars, awaiting the telegram, confirming his gamble paid off. He knew this was the last roll of dice for British power in the Middle East. But as Roosevelt opened his suitcase in a Tehran safehouse, he wasn't just unleashing a coup, he was unleashing a ghost, starting a chain reaction that would destroy a nation's democratic hopes, radicalize a generation, and eventually lead to the very Islamic revolution the West fears today. The British wanted their dividend. They were about to purchase a 50-year nightmare. In sweltering August 1953, the British Empire's fate in the Middle East rested with a single American spy in a Tehran basement. Roosevelt's mission was ostensibly political, stopping communism, but purely financial, recovering Anglo-Iranian Oil Company assets. With $1 million cash, a network of paid agitators, and a plan relying less on military strategy than theatrical chaos, Operation Ajax was designed to look like popular uprising, a fake revolution purchased wholesale. Roosevelt began bribing the Iranian press, handing thick envelopes to editors and columnists. Overnight, Tehran papers printed vicious attacks calling Mossadegh an atheist, Jew, British agent, and communist spy simultaneously. The contradictions didn't matter. The goal was confusion. Then Roosevelt hired gang leaders from the Zurkhaneh, traditional Persian houses of strength, muscle men, weightlifters, wrestlers commanding local respect and fear. For a few $100s, they organized mobs. One mob shouted, "Long live Mossadegh," while smashing shop windows and beating pedestrians. Another mob attacked them, shouting, "Long live the Shah." The idea? Create total anarchy, making ordinary Tehran citizens terrified of Mossadegh's rule. British agents, still communicating from shadows, provided intelligence on which generals could be bought and which clerics persuaded to preach against government. But the coup needed a mechanical trigger. The Shah signing 2 royal decrees, one dismissing Mossadegh, another appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi, a Nazi sympathizer and British asset. The young, indecisive Shah was terrified, knowing if the coup failed, he'd lose his throne. He hesitated, bags packed, ready to flee. To stiffen his spine, the British Broadcasting Corporation played a crucial role. In 1953, it was weaponized. The Shah agreed to sign only upon receiving a specific BBC Persian service signal. Usually at midnight, the announcer said, "It is now midnight." On coup night, he said, "It is now exactly midnight." The Shah heard the extra word and signed the decrees. On August 15th night, the coup began. An Imperial Guard colonel drove to arrest Mossadegh, but he'd been tipped off by Tudeh party infiltrators who knew it was coming. Instead of a sleeping prime minister, the colonel found himself surrounded by loyal troops and tanks. The arrest failed, the colonel was captured, the coup collapsed before starting. Panic swept conspirators. The Shah fled instantly, flying first to Baghdad, then Rome, where he sat in hotel lobbies depressed, convinced he'd never see Iran again. Washington was horrified, ordering Roosevelt to evacuate immediately. Operation failed, get out while you can. But Roosevelt was a gambler. Realizing the military coup failed, but the psychological part remained in play, he doubled down. He'd run the coup again, but this time using mobs, not armies. For 3 days, Roosevelt flooded Tehran with cash, emptying his safe, paying anyone holding a stick or rock. He organized massive demonstrations, paid fake communists to attack mosques, enraging religious populations, and paid clerics to declare holy war against government. On August 19th, the second wave hit, a tsunami of paid violence. Thousands marched on government buildings, burned pro-Mossadegh newspaper offices, attacked police stations. Crucially, neutral army units switched sides, seeing momentum shift. General Zahedi, hiding in a CIA safehouse, emerged riding atop a tank. The final battle occurred at 109 Cox Street, Mossadegh's home, a brutal, intimate siege. Pro-Shah tanks blasted the gates, while loyal guards fought back with machine guns and bazookas. For hours, the street was a war zone. Hundreds died. The house was pounded into rubble. Finally, ammunition gone and roof collapsing, Mossadegh surrendered. An old man in pajamas who dared tell the British Empire that Iran wasn't a gas station. He was arrested. The radio announced, "Mossadegh's government has been crushed. Long live the Shah." In Rome, the Shah turned pale at lunch. "I knew they loved me," he reportedly said, flying back to Tehran triumphantly, greeted by generals who'd sold out his country. In London, Churchill was ecstatic, lighting fresh cigars. The gamble paid off, the thief was caught, the oil was safe. The British Empire had proven it could still topple governments and dictate terms to the Third World. But when bankers arrived to divide spoils, the British received a nasty shock. They'd launched the coup to save Anglo-Iranian Oil Company monopoly, wanting 100% ownership back. But Americans who'd done heavy lifting, paying bribes, organizing mobs, had different ideas. The U.S. government told Churchill bluntly the old monopoly was dead. Exclusive British colonialism was over. Iranian oil industry would restart as an international consortium. The deal signed in 1954 humiliated Britain, masked as victory. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was renamed British Petroleum, but forced to surrender 40% to American oil giants, including Standard Oil and Texaco. Another 14% went to Dutch and French. Britain retained only 40% of what it once owned completely. Churchill won the Tehran battle, but lost the dominance war. He'd invited the American fox into the British henhouse. The coup marked definitive end of British Middle East supremacy and beginning of the American era. The U.S. was no longer a regional spectator. It was now landlord. The operation's financial cost, $1 million. For that, the West secured 25 years of cheap oil. Profits flowed again, the British Treasury replenished, dividends paid, crisis over. But the real bill wouldn't come due for another 25 years, and it wouldn't be paid in money. By overthrowing a democratic secular nationalist leader, Britain and America destroyed Iran's political center. Mossadegh wasn't communist. He was a liberal who wanted a constitution. By crushing him, the West sent a clear message to Iranians. Democratic change is impossible. You cannot use the ballot box because the CIA will overturn it. This left only one opposition avenue: the mosque. The Shah, restored to his throne, became a dictator, paranoid, knowing he owed his crown to foreigners, not his people. He created Savak, a secret police trained by CIA and Israeli Mossad. Savak became notorious for brutality, hunting down communists, liberals, anyone whispering against the king. For 2 decades, the Shah ruled with an iron fist, fueled by oil wealth from the new consortium. He modernized Iran, building highways and universities, but wealth stayed at the top. Corruption was grotesque. Resentment grew. In mosques, clerics told the story of 1953, how the Great Satan America and Old Fox Britain stole the country's dignity. They turned Mossadegh into a martyr, not of liberalism, but of resistance. The religious opposition leader was exiled Ayatollah Khomeini. In 1979, the bill finally arrived. The Iranian Revolution swept the Shah from power, a revolution fueled by 1953's delayed rage. When students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats hostage, they weren't just angry about the Shah's cancer treatment. They were angry about Kermit Roosevelt, about the coup. They were refighting 1953's battle, and this time, they won. Iran's loss in 1979 was a geopolitical catastrophe for the West, creating an enemy regime haunting the region today. It led to the Iran-Iraq War, Hezbollah's rise, and the nuclear standoff we face now. All this traces back to the decision made in London in 1951 to prioritize an oil company's balance sheet over a nation's sovereignty. Churchill believed he was saving the British economy. Short-term, he did. Oil money kept the welfare state afloat another decade, allowing Britain to pretend it was a superpower a little longer. But the price was the West's moral standing. The coup proved that for all the talk of democracy and freedom, when money was on the line, the British Empire was nothing more than a debt collection agency with a spy network. The oil heist was the last gasp of old imperial business, a tactical success and strategic disaster. It taught the world that resources are a curse, and that the hand feeding you today might strangle you tomorrow if profit margins drop. Britain lost its oil monopoly in 1954. It lost influence in 1979. but it lost its honor in that Tehran basement in 1953. The millions of pounds BP earned in intervening years were spent long ago, but the hatred sown in those hot August days still yields a bitter harvest. This concludes the story of how Britain lost Iran, how a desperate, bankrupt empire tried stealing a future it couldn't afford, and ended up paying a price. The whole world is still settling today,